Welcome to the module on climate change and international political economy. In this particular module, the discussions will be made on the public awareness about the climate change urgency, which is very much apt in these current times due to the global destruction of the environment and its resources, reducing the GHG emissions, that is the greenhouse gas emissions, through policy and action, which calls for the adoption for proper policy perspectives, an action which can be taken up by the institutions, government, and at all the multi-levels, promoting the sustainable practices and innovation. This is very much important with regard to the SDG goals, mitigate the climatic impacts on vulnerable communities and ecosystems, because the vulnerable communities mainly refer to the endangered species, also refers to the natural resources, protection of the biodiversity, and thereby the ecosystems, so that the access to the essential services does not get affected. Moreover, international cooperation and the governance for the climate action is also needed. This also calls for a good economic and a global order. In this particular module, the discussions will be on the climate change. So as a part of the climate change, how can we define or give it an holistic view? It is basically a phenomena which is rather a global phenomena. So in this global phenomena, we come across a range of human activities such as the burning of fossil fuels, deforestation, industrial processes. All of them are basically contributing to the destruction of the natural resources. And these are the result of the human activities as a result of industrialization, urbanization, and more consumerism within the globe. These activities have resulted to the rise in the atmospheric gases, which has caused the global temperatures to rise. That is how the global warming has come up in place. So this temperature has resulted to the melting of glaciers, ice caps, and even contributed to the natural disasters. So in all, this has resulted to the environmental concern. So climatic changes also have an impact on the natural environment, human wealth, and the socio-economic development. So when I talk about the human wealth, basically refers to the human welfare. And this is also coming up as environmental governance, essential tool for promoting the sustainable development. This basically refers to an approach which is both collaborative and inclusive, because in order to address these climate change issues, we have to take care of the stakeholders, we have to take care of the regulatory authority, and more importantly, the transparency, the regulatory frameworks, the accountability, the science-based practices which should take up for the broader developmental strategies. Then only we can say that the developmental perspective can be taken care of. Moreover, when we talk about the climate change, when we talk about the biodiversity and environmental pollution, all these requires immediate actions. And thereby we can take care of the conservation efforts, we can take care of the management practices, how the human society can be affected, and how the greenhouse gases can be reduced, and all these things requires a proactive action. Moreover, we can see that the environmental challenges are huge, governance capacity and institutional arrangements are taken up, so there should be proper compliance with the authorities, with the political structure, economic structures, and most importantly, the financing and the resource management must be in place, because this also calls for a proper funding that has to be done in this regard. So addressing these challenges requires investment in the institutions, because this is basically coming up from a capital constraint which may occur whenever these institutions are not in the proper process. So this requires proper investment, proper capacity building, which means how the capacity building takes place in terms of environment management. Institutional reforms must be in place. Enforcement and compliance mechanisms must be there, which will be there in tune with all the orders. Innovative financing mechanisms, which is very much important because financing issues come up. And in all these areas, what we need is a strong governance system where all the stakeholders will be involved. Sufficient environmental governance can take place, challenges also can take place, so that the societies can be more adaptable. So that is how the challenges can take up in this particular society. So in order to find out the impact of this climate change on the global economy, we basically refers to the globe or the nations across the globe and how are they affected. Firstly, we refer to the climate change, which has an economic impact across the globe. This economic impact is in terms of the economic adversities that are created. For example, more industrialization leads to air pollution, leads to emission of the greenhouse effect gases, and thereby biodiversity loss takes place. Also, there are health hazards which are arising out of environmental degradation. Moreover, we can see that the cost of the mitigation and the adaptation efforts are expected to be substantial, because this also refers to some kind of cost which must be incurred to reduce this environmental cost. Secondly, it is said that the World Bank, which is projecting the cost of adapting the climate change, reach $70 to $100 billion per year by 2050. So this is one of the projections which are done by the World Bank, so that in the near future, the entire environmental cost will account to $70 to $100 billion, and that would be the cost which should reach to protect the environmental concern. The impact of the climate change also differs across the industries and the regions. For example, agriculture is very much vulnerable because thereby the entire kind of deforestation taking place, which is causing a change in the temperature, the precipitation patterns, and thereby also affecting the fertility of the soil, crop yield, and finally the food prices are cropping up. So any kind of environmental concern will have a direct impact on the economic structure, particularly in the pricing systems, also will result into more inflationary trend due to all these kind of factors which are interlinked with each other. The second important issue is about the insurance industry. Because any kind of natural disaster which are climate related disasters like floods, hurricane, they result in huge loss, and this loss is actually not of human loss but also the resource, infrastructure and capital losses. So insurance industry is also at risk to compensate all these losses which are arising because of the adverse effects of the climate change. The potential for economic disruption, basically economic disruption refers to the instability in the price level, taking away the jobs, and in many ways diverting to the destruction of the production. Instability also is an issue in terms of the livelihoods, is a concern. So the World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report 2021 identified climate action failure as the greatest global risk in terms of likelihood and impact. So whenever we talk about the likelihood ratios, means the probability of occurrence of this type of disasters and the impact, everywhere the risk is huge because compensatory losses are very high. Climate related events are taking place like extreme weather, rise in the sea level, resource scarcity, all these things are coming up as the loss of the environmental concern. And that will refer to the social unrest, because when we talk about the social unrest, it basically refers to the livelihoods, or people are basically being taken away from their homes and they're migrating to other places to protect themselves from these climate related disasters. So this migration becomes a huge problem or a huge issue, and thereby resulting to conflict. And this conflict is not only because of social conflict, political conflict, cultural conflict, and more importantly, the entire disruption occurs in the social transformation. So there are opportunities for economic growth and development in a low carbon future. Wherever you find out a low carbon emissions, there definitely the livelihood protection is being done. Renewable energy takes place. So with the International Renewable Energy Agency, also we can see that the sector could come up with 42 million jobs by 2050. So this is coming up as one of the prediction by the World Bank that if the sector can take care of these concerns, then job creation can be done. Otherwise, the migration and the conflicts will be a perennial problem. So governments, businesses, individuals, all are playing an important role in this climate change, and they can build a more resilient and a sustainable global economy, because that is how their collaborative action and inclusive approach will take place. So when we talk about international political economy, we talk about a framework. This framework is basically a boundary which will recognize that addressing climate change should have a coordinated effort. And this coordinated effort should be among the all stakeholders in the society, which will be balancing growth and development together, because it has been seen that growth is done at the cost of environment without taking care of the developmental issues, because developmental issues are more varied and more wide. So it is seen that the goals of SDG, where the many countries are relying on the carbon-intensive industries for growth, so their transition to the low-carbon economy can be expensive and challenging. Because whenever we consider that the countries which are basically going for more capital-intensive mode of production, thereby the carbon dioxide emissions are huge. So for them, any kind of production model which calls for low carbon emissions will be always high cost effective and rather more challenging. So international cooperation is very much needed in this regard, because emissions in one country can affect the other parts of the globe. So this has a spillover effect. So it has come up by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is very much important forum to discuss on these issues, which was established in 1992 to facilitate international cooperation on climate change. So UNFCCC is basically United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which will take care of how internationally a kind of a consensus can be done to protect and take care of the environment. The Paris Agreement in 2015 also calls for a global cooperation, because that also is an important issue to limit the global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius, and thereby making it actually within the tolerance limits, because that is also affecting the extreme temperatures across the different tropical and the subtropical regions of the globe. Here also we take care of the private sector. So when we talk about the private sector, we basically refer to the sustainable practices that are being done, and this also refers to some kind of inequalities between the developed and the developing countries, how it can be avoided. So any kind of inequality is a concern which can be avoided between the countries so that the things can be in place. Moreover, we have seen that the developed countries are basically being responsible for the majority of the greenhouse gases, and developing countries are lacking the resources and technology to go for a low carbon economy. That means it has been seen that there is a kind of a dichotomy, because the developed countries are more responsible because they are the industrialized nations and they are basically developed, or they are basically dependent on the industrial units. And developing countries do not have the funding capacity to restore to any kind of low carbon economy. So as a result, this IPE, International Political Economy Framework, emphasizes the need to address these inequalities so that countries both have resources and technology to address the climate change. So that is how it is an interaction between the politics and the economics, so that the addressing climate change can occur, which will go for international cooperation, which will go for proper financing, and more importantly, technology transfer. That is how a low carbon economy can take place. Economic inequalities also can be addressed. So in all these discussions, we can see that the most important objective of this IPE framework is to facilitate the global cooperation, address them the challenges, and how we can ensure a better model for economic growth and development. Now, the most important issue that arises in this regard is the global governance and the climate change, because it has been seen that UNFCCC will call for international cooperation, but that requires a proper governance order to be in place. So the Paris Agreement, which came up in 2015, explains a significant effort in this climatic governance so that the countries can submit all these nationally determined contributions, their emission reduction targets and the strategies. This is very important because the countries are supposed to actually surrender their carbon emission limits, and how they can basically go for these emission targets and the strategies, that is very much important. This agreement also makes it clear that any kind of adaptation of this support for developing these countries requires several challenges. Moreover, one of the key challenges is the lack of the political will and the leadership to address climate change at the global level. Because at the global level, there are conflicting interests as well as there are priorities which are concern of the environment. So any kind of concern also takes place in this regard. Another challenge is the power symmetry, because developed nations always go for a power struggle and their aim is for a superpower across the globe. And one of the most important ways to achieve this power is making the country to be more industrialized without taking care of the environmental concern. So this is a kind of a power symmetry which occurs between the developed and the developing countries, and thereby unequal distribution of benefits and burdens takes place, because these distributions are unequal in terms of the countries and how they can hinder the cooperation in this regard. So climate change is basically a cross-cutting issue that requires collaboration among the different sectors, as it involves both the government and the private institutions. And also the coordination among them is very crucial, particularly with the advent of perspectives and the objectives which are defined. More importantly, whenever these challenges are addressed, efforts must be made to attain the global climate governance. So this includes the increase of the political will and the leadership, stronger communication and the advocacy efforts. Financial incentives should be there. At the same time, funding must come up from the international organizations. So all of them will take a pivotal role on the climate change. Institutional reform and the capacity building also is very much necessary to ensure this global order. That means better coordination among the institutions, organizations, civil society. Efforts must be there so that a global climate governance becomes an issue. So by addressing all of them, we can see the sustainable development goals are addressed, impacts of climate change are done, so that the proper infrastructural requirements are taken care of. This basically refers to the most important aspect of this discussion, that what is the interlinking effects of climate change on economic development. Because economic development is a holistic concept which takes care of not only the development of the economic parameters, but also the climatic, the political, the institutional, and all the other parameters that are combined in the process. So this is basically significant and multifaceted. So any kind of climate change which is an adverse effect in terms of rising temperature, extreme weather conditions, which are basically affecting all the sectors and all the particular prioritized areas. Agricultural production gets affected because of these climatic disorders. Energy consumption also gets affected to a higher extent, where we talk about energy deficit in most of the nations across the globe. Water resources are exhausted, leading to water scarcity. Infrastructure and also the crucial for economic growth. So when I talk about the infrastructure, it basically refers mainly to the infrastructural concerns. So climate change has a significant challenge, particularly for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which talks of eradication of poverty, economic growth, and mainly environmental sustainability. So to address the climate change, a shift towards a low carbon economy is necessary, and this shift basically refers to a transition from a high carbon to a low carbon economy with more and more emphasis of renewable energy, sufficiency and sustainable practices. So whenever I talk about this transition, this will involve more and more investment in the research and development, technological transfer, so that economic opportunities and sustainable environment can be done. So here we talk about technological transfer and also we talk about the foreign investment. Because in all these actions, the most important is to create a logistical framework, a supply chain network where foreign investments must be there, so that with the advent of the foreign investment, economic opportunities and the livelihoods can be created. This basically refers to a concept of a clean energy, wind, solar and hydropower, because all these are considered as the sustainable source of energy consumption, reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, and so that there can be an automatic transition to a low carbon economy. This will have a less impact on the cost mitigation because here the environment concerns or the policymakers should make sufficient funding or any kind of public-private partnership models to foster all these kind of hydropower stations, wind stations or solar power stations. So energy efficiency measures like building the insulation, smart appliances, efficient transportation systems all should come in place. So we talk about sustainable use of land practices which takes care of reforestation, conservation. All these things are important for carbon reduction, promoting the sustainability and the land management. And also these are important for economic livelihoods. For example, ecotourism, sustainability of the wood products and creating the economic opportunities. There has been large initiative from the government of India to come up with the special economic zones. So when we talk about the SEZs, they also should like to invest in such an SEZ which operate with an ecotourism or an eco-friendly environment, which we talk about the green economy. Moreover, it has been seen that any kind of transition will definitely take care of the job opportunities, development of the new technologies, and more importantly, the potential for the new markets. Now we go back to the important issues of climate change and how it affects the trade mechanism, because any kind of economy in a global framework under the International Political Economic Convention should participate across the borders. So that is how the relationship between international trade and climate change is also complex and multifaceted. So movement of the goods and services across the borders contributes mainly to the greenhouse emissions, particularly to transport activities. This is very much important because whenever we talk about any kind of trading, it basically refers to the transport costs which are involved, and thereby any kind of emission can take place. So as we have seen that with the advent of the trade liberalization, whereby the capital account and the current account relaxations are done in terms of the import and export of goods, both visible and invisible, globalization have led to the changes in the patterns of production and consumption. So whenever this production and consumption are changed in terms of more and more capital goods, more capital intensive mode of production, which more emissions of the carbon dioxide or sulfur dioxide or any kind of particulate matters. So this basically refers to the WTO, that is World Trade Organizations, and how it can make this issue of climate change. So WTO will protect the environment. It will take care of sensitizing these environmental issues, which will allow the countries to impose the trade restrictions, take care of the public health, which is very much important under the energy policy and the health policy of any nation, as long they can do in a non-discriminatory manner. That means this should be applied for all, not for the selected few. This also refers to the WTO in terms of the intellectual property rights, which is TRIPS, so that the sound technologies can be there where the emissions can be reduced. This also takes care of the trade agreements which the countries must sign. And by signing such trade agreements, they can access to these technological innovations which can be polluting controlling device. However, there are concerns with the trade liberalization because whenever the countries are competing with one another to attract more and more foreign investment, they have to compromise with the environmental standards. It is seen that the countries which has less strict environmental regulations, those countries are attracting more of FDI. So that means this is one of the concern across the globe, that if any country has less stringencies, then more FDI will come in. So this is a competition among the countries to relax environmental laws so as to increase their level of foreign capital. So to address these challenges, some scholars have proposed that WTO should come up with more promoting sustainable trade. And then only we can see that the rules and the regulations and the consumption practices can be taken up. So this will very much come in process with the WTO regulations. So additionally, we can see that the WTO could work with international organizations under the framework of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Then only the climate issues can be taken care of, which can be very much inherent with the entire process. So international trade basically has a significant impact on the climate change because trade liberalization leads to increase in the emissions, but WTO should protect the environment. They should come up with a more proactive role and work with the international organizations in a cohesive manner, because these international organizations are very much in order with this growth so that they can work together and make the process to be more sustaining. This refers to some kind of discussions on international cooperation and climate change, because this is basically concentrating on how the impact can be done, particularly by the Paris Agreement, and also how to stabilize the greenhouse gas emissions. This is taking care of the concentrations in the atmosphere, how the human activity can be creating more dangerous platform so that some kind of regulations and mitigations can be adopted. So this is basically calling for a Paris Agreement, which calls for the countries to report on their emissions, progress on their targets, and increase their efforts over time, because any such kind of reporting is needed at every juncture regarding any industrialized nation. So despite these efforts, global emissions have been continued to rise and impact on climate change has becoming more and more severe. All the countries must come up together, particularly in terms of developed and developing, and thereby they should address their limited resources, and with their limited resources they must address these targets. And for addressing these targets, there should be the framework like UNFCCC or Paris Agreement. They should make efforts to reduce these emissions and make more climate change. Another important challenge is that the countries must adhere to their commitments. Particularly, each of the countries should have the regular meeting and they should update every 5 years. And then only they can come up or satisfy their commitments. And in the same manner, they should try to finance the technology transfer so that the transition to the low carbon economy can be done, and so that some kind of mechanisms can be established for Green Climate Fund. This is actually one of the sponsorships which can be done by these countries so that this Green Climate Fund can be financed by all the nations. Particularly, the funding agency has to be created by these organizations to support the developing countries at the times of exigencies. Then only we can say that the international cooperation, the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, they should work hand in hand and they should go for an international cooperation. And this will increase their ambition over time. They will address the financing and the technology needs in a more proactive manner, and then only we can ensure a more safe and a sustainable future. So in this particular module, the discussions are mainly on the climate change, which is a complex and a multifaceted issue, which is definitely holistic in nature, and it's one of the steps towards global governance. So this calls for an intersection between the climate change and international political economy so that we can take care of the amalgamation of three factors: economic, social, and political. Secondly, we can also say that all these capabilities of the nations must be clearly addressed because every nation does not have an equal funding. So these capabilities must be there in all. And to achieve a sustainable and a resilient future, they should work in a collaborative manner. So this will ensure that the stakeholders' commitment, involvement, transparency and accountability, All these issues must work hand in hand so as to address a good economic order. Moreover, it has been seen that any kind of mitigation efforts must be balanced. That means it should not take away only the concern of the developed nations and not the concern of the developing nations. They should enhance the resilience. So investment must be done in the innovative solutions. They should take care of the agricultural practices. They should lead to the innovations in technology so that energy can be saved. And more there should be a transition to a low carbon economy. More importantly, the public education and awareness campaigns must be there because these are more important, particularly for the civic society, to learn how to conserve energy, how to protect environment, and how to mobilize the public support so that they can work hand in hand. So overall, addressing climate change is a comprehensive and an integrated approach which should be taking care of all the stakeholders in the society and which is a complex issue. But it basically involves economic, social and political realities of all countries, of all regions. So by working together, they can go for a very strong, sustainable and a resilient future. The future is basically dependent upon a good effort to take care of the environment, to take care of the climate change so that all the considerations are taken care of. Then only a strong and a resilient future can be attained.